In the spring of 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic reached its darkest hour. The outcome of the Second World War hinged not on tanks in Russia or bombers over Germany, but on the cold, unforgiving waters of the North Atlantic. Here, vast convoys carried the lifeblood of Britain: food, oil, weapons, and troops across a hostile ocean. If those convoys stopped, Britain would starve, and the Allied war effort would collapse before it could truly begin. Standing in the way were Hitler's U-boats. These submarines, sleek and deadly, prowled the shipping lanes in coordinated packs. By day they lurked beneath the waves, by night they surfaced to strike, their torpedoes cutting through steel hulls with devastating precision. For sailors, the Atlantic crossing was a gauntlet of terror. Silent hours broken by sudden explosions, flames on the horizon, and the icy plunge into dark waters. In 1942 alone, U-boats sank over 1,000 Allied ships. Losses were so heavy that Winston Churchill later admitted, "The only thing that ever really frightened me during the war was the U-boat peril." Germany believed they were strangling Britain into submission, and for a time they were dangerously close. The Allies had escorts, destroyers, corvettes, and sloops, but they could not be everywhere at once. Aircraft could spot and attack U-boats, but land. Based bombers lacked the range to patrol the vast mid-Atlantic gap, a stretch of ocean where convoys sailed without any air cover. In this black pit, wolf packs attacked with impunity. Sailors called it the Valley of Death. The solution, when it came, was small, improvised, and at first underestimated. It was the escort carrier, nicknamed the Baby Flattop. Built on converted merchant hulls, these carriers were tiny compared to their fleet carrier cousins. They carried perhaps 20 aircraft instead of 90, and they could steam at only 18 knots, barely faster than the convoys they escorted. Their wooden flight decks creaked in heavy seas, and their crews lived in cramped conditions. To many naval officers, they seemed weak, fragile, and almost laughable. But the genius of the escort carrier was not in size or speed. It was in presence. For the first time, convoys could bring their own airfield to sea. Those 20 aircraft, patrol bombers, fighters, and torpedo planes, could scout hundreds of miles ahead, hunt submarines, and strike before wolf packs closed in. A single baby carrier could turn a convoy from helpless prey into a deadly trap. When the USS Bog first joined convoy duty in the spring of 1943, few in Germany took notice. U-boat commanders dismissed her as a converted freighter with little real value. But within months, they would learn the hard way that these floating crates were anything but harmless. The arrival of escort carriers would change the rhythm of the Atlantic War. For the Allies, the appearance of these small carriers was a sign of hope in an otherwise grim campaign. For the Germans, it was the beginning of a nightmare. The stage was set for a new chapter in the Battle of the Atlantic, one in which tiny ships would wield an outsized power, and the hunters of the sea would suddenly find themselves the hunted. When the USS Bog sailed on her first convoy escort missions in 1943, expectations were modest. She looked awkward, barely more than a freighter with a flight deck bolted on. Her crew joked about serving on a second-hand ship, while seasoned naval officers doubted such vessels would make a difference in the raging Atlantic War. But appearances were deceiving. In the grey waters of the North Atlantic, the Bog carried with her something no convoy had ever possessed before, an eye in the sky. Her handful of aircraft extended the convoy's vision far beyond the horizon. Instead of waiting for wolf packs to surface and strike, the Allies could now spot them first, stalk them, and hit them before they attacked. The change was immediate. In May 1943, just weeks into her first patrol, aircraft from the Bog detected a U-boat lurking near a convoy. A Grumman TBF Avenger, fitted with radar and depth charges, swooped down through cloud and rain. The submarine, caught on the surface, tried to dive, but it was too late. Depth charges churned the sea, and within moments, U-569 slipped beneath the waves, crippled beyond recovery. It was one of the first times an escort carrier had drawn blood in the Atlantic. The success electrified the Allies. Convoy sailors who had once felt like helpless targets suddenly found reassurance in the droning presence of carrier-borne aircraft overhead. The psychological effect was as important as the tactical one. U-boats could no longer approach with impunity. The Germans, meanwhile, were stunned. Admiral Karl Donitz, commander of the U-boat fleet, had not anticipated such a threat. His wolfpacks were designed to exploit gaps in Allied defences, but escort carriers were sealing those gaps one by one. Every time a periscope broke the surface, there was a chance it would be spotted by a circling Avenger or Wildcat fighter. The hunters of the deep were now being hunted from above. More carriers followed. The USS Card joined the fight, sailing with her own convoys across the Atlantic. In her very first cruise, aircraft from Card found and destroyed multiple U-boats, including U-117 and U-664. Each sinking not only saved lives and cargo, but also chipped away at German morale. Submarine crews began to whisper about the convoy carriers, those small ships that somehow always seemed to be in the right place at the right time. The victories came at a crucial moment. In early 1943, U-boats were sinking Allied shipping at a catastrophic rate. Entire convoys were being mauled, and Britain's survival hung in the balance. Yet by the summer of that same year, the tide was shifting. Escort carriers were not working alone. They operated as part of a growing system of intelligence, radar, long-range patrol bombers, and improved anti-submarine tactics. But the carriers gave convoys something they had never had before: constant, mobile, and lethal air cover in the very heart of the ocean. For the men aboard U-boats, the effect was chilling. Days once spent cruising the surface to recharge batteries and coordinate attacks were now fraught with danger. Aircraft could appear at any time, plunging out of the clouds, their engines roaring, depth charges ready to fall. What had once been a battlefield of opportunity was becoming a graveyard of submarines. The USS Borg and Card proved what skeptics had doubted. These small carriers were not makeshift experiments. They were ship killers, force multipliers, and the bane of the wolfpacks. Their early victories signalled the beginning of a new phase in the Atlantic struggle, one in which the Germans would find themselves increasingly on the defensive. By the end of 1943, the escort carrier had gone from an untested idea to a decisive weapon. The balance of power in the Atlantic was shifting, and the U-boat menace was beginning to crumble. By the end of 1943, the escort carrier was no longer seen as a temporary fix. It had become the centerpiece of a new Allied strategy. Dozens of these baby flattops now sailed with convoys across the Atlantic. Each one was a floating airfield, carrying Avengers armed with radar and depth charges, and Wildcat fighters ready to strafe any U-boat daring to surface. The results were dramatic. In convoy after convoy, the hunters became the hunted. U-boats attempting to stalk Allied shipping now faced a gauntlet of patrols that reached hundreds of miles beyond the convoy's perimeter. Submarine commanders could no longer rely on surprise. The moment they raised a periscope or broke the surface to recharge, they risked detection by roving aircraft. The psychological shift was enormous. Once feared as predators, U-boats now lived in constant fear themselves. Crews who had once relished the freedom of the mid-Atlantic gap spoke of relentless patrol planes that seemed to appear from nowhere, diving out of the clouds with guns blazing. The sea, which had once been their hunting ground, was turning against them. Some of the most decisive blows were struck by the USS Card. In the fall of 1943, Card's aircraft launched a series of devastating attacks on U-boats operating in wolfpacks. Within a single patrol, they destroyed or crippled several submarines, forcing Donitz to withdraw his boats from entire convoy routes. For the first time, the wolfpacks were not simply disrupted, they were annihilated. Other escort carriers like USS Core and USS Croatan followed suit. Together, they hunted down U-boats with ruthless efficiency. By 1944, Allied reports recorded entire convoys crossing the Atlantic without losing a single ship, an outcome that had been unthinkable just a year before. Technology played a role, but the carriers amplified its impact. Radar-equipped Avengers could spot U-boats on the surface even at night. Fido, the new homing torpedo, gave aircraft a deadly weapon that submarines could not easily evade. Intelligence from cracked German codes, passed through the secret Ultra program, allowed escort carriers to sail directly into the path of wolf packs. Each advantage on its own was powerful, but combined with escort carriers, they became overwhelming. For the U-boat force, the cost was staggering. In 1943 alone, Germany lost 237 submarines. The ocean that had once been their battlefield was now a graveyard. Crews began to speak of flattop fever, a gnawing dread that a carrier might be lurking just beyond the horizon, waiting to strike. Admiral Karl Donitz, the architect of the U-boat campaign, admitted the truth. The Battle of the Atlantic was turning against Germany. No matter how many submarines he sent to sea, they could not overcome the new Allied defences. For every merchant ship lost, multiple U-boats were destroyed. The balance of attrition had reversed. By early 1944, the Allies had achieved what once seemed impossible. Convoys were arriving in Britain faster than U-boats could sink them. Supplies flowed in a steady stream: tanks, aircraft, fuel, and troops, preparing the way for the liberation of Europe. Without that lifeline, D-Day would never have been possible. Escort carriers, though small and unglamorous, had secured the flow of men and material that would ultimately overwhelm Nazi Germany. In the cold Atlantic, the tide of war had turned. By mid-1944, the tide of the Atlantic War had turned decisively. What had once been a desperate struggle for survival was now a steady march toward victory. Allied convoys sailed with growing confidence, their decks stacked with tanks, aircraft, fuel, and men bound for Europe. Behind this transformation stood many factors: code-breaking, radar, improved weapons. But none symbolized the shift more clearly than the escort carrier. These ships, humble in size and modest in appearance, had played an outsized role in ending the U-boat threat. They had not fought for glory in great fleet actions, nor had they launched massive strikes against enemy battleships or carriers. Instead, their war was one of patience, persistence, and constant vigilance. Patrol after patrol, day after day, their aircraft scoured the ocean, driving submarines from the surface and crushing those that lingered too long. The statistics tell the story. Between 1942 and 1945, U.S. escort carriers and their aircraft destroyed dozens of German U-boats, directly and indirectly saving countless lives and millions of tons of cargo. The mere presence of a baby flattop in a convoy reduced losses dramatically. For sailors, seeing one on the horizon was like seeing a guardian angel, promising that the skies above were no longer empty. For the Germans, it was the opposite. By 1944, many U-boat crews felt they were being sent on suicide missions. The Atlantic, once their hunting ground, had become a place of fear and attrition. Submariners spoke of endless patrol planes circling overhead, of convoys bristling with escorts, and of the dreaded aircraft carrier escorts that seemed to stalk them relentlessly. The hunter's advantage had slipped away forever. Escort carriers were not without sacrifice. They faced the same brutal seas as the convoys they protected, and they too came under attack. Some were struck by torpedoes or bombs, others lost aircraft and men to the harsh Atlantic weather. But their resilience and constant presence proved decisive. Each small ship multiplied the strength of the convoys many times over. When historians look back on the Second World War, the escort carrier often receives less attention than the great fleet carriers of the Pacific or the battleships of old. Yet their contribution was no less vital. Without them, the Atlantic lifeline might have been severed. Without that lifeline, Britain could not have been sustained, and the Allied invasion of Europe might never have been launched. The USS Borg, Card, Core, and their sister ships earned a reputation out of all proportion to their size. They became known as killer carriers, feared by you, boat crews across the Atlantic. In the words of one Allied sailor, they were small, they were ugly, but to us they were beautiful. They meant we would live to see another day. By 1945, the Battle of the Atlantic was over. The U-boat fleet lay shattered, its losses unsustainable, its mission failed. The Allies controlled the sea lanes, ensuring the steady flow of men and material that would bring final victory in Europe. In that victory, the Escort carrier had played a decisive role. These unassuming ships, born of desperation, proved that sometimes the simplest solutions can have the greatest impact. They turned convoys into fortresses, transformed prey into hunters, and rewrote the balance of power in the Atlantic. Their legacy endures, not in grand monuments or famous battles, but in the knowledge that they safeguarded the lifeline of freedom when it was most at risk. In the cold, grey waters of the Atlantic, the baby Flattops helped secure the Allied victory in World War Roman.